The faint, almost imperceptible hum of the hospital lighting was the only consistent sound in the room, a sterile white noise that did little to soothe the tempest of silence between them. Victor Newman stood as he always did, a monument to his own will, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his gaze fixed not on the man in the bed but on the indistinct world beyond the window, a world he commanded with a phone call, yet one that felt impossibly distant in this sanitized space. In the bed, his son Adam lay propped up against a mountain of pillows, the pallor of his skin a stark contrast to the crisp, bleached linen. The bandages around his head were a glaring testament to the violence that had once again found its way into their lives. A violence that seemed to shadow Adam with a cruel and unerring precision. The air was thick with words unspoken. A lifetime of accusations, disappointments, and a fractured, twisted love that neither man knew how to articulate without drawing blood. Adam's fingers twitched against the sheet, a nervous, restless motion that betrayed the calm he was trying to project. He could feel the weight of his father's judgment even without eye contact, a pressure bearing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe than the bruised ribs already did. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, to ask why once again. He was the one lying broken while the family business, the true object of Victor's devotion, continued its relentless march without him. But the words caught in his throat, a tangled knot of pride and pain. Victor, for his part, was calculating the angles as always. The concern was there, a genuine paternal fear that had gripped his heart when the call came in, but it was immediately compartmentalized, filtered through the prism of corporate strategy and familial control. This wasn't just an attack on his son, it was an attack on a Newman, and therefore an attack on the empire itself. His mind raced through a list of rivals, disgruntled former employees, and the ever-present specter of Jack Abbott. Yet a darker, more unsettling thought lingered at the edges of his consciousness, the possibility that Adam's own notorious past, his knack for creating devastating enemies, had simply come home to roost. The door swinging open was a welcome intrusion, shattering the unbearable tension. Dr. Nate Reed entered, his demeanor a perfect blend of professional competence and genuine empathy, a skill he'd honed navigating the turbulent waters of Genoa City's elite. He offered a small, reassuring nod to Victor before turning his full attention to Adam. "How are we feeling today?" he asked, his voice calm and measured as he reached for the chart at the foot of the bed. "Like I was on the losing end of a debate with a freight train," Adam rasped, the attempt at wit falling flat amidst the obvious strain in his voice. Nate's smile was gentle, understanding. "The scans are looking better. The swelling has decreased significantly. You're a very lucky man, Adam." Victor finally turned from the window, his steely eyes fixing on Nate. "Lucky is a relative term, Doctor. What I need to know is when he will be able to resume his duties." The question hung in the air, a blatant prioritization of business over well-being. Adam's jaw tightened, a flicker of betrayal in his eyes before he quickly masked it. Nate, ever the diplomat, didn't flinch. "His duties are rest and recovery, Victor. For now and for the foreseeable future. The body needs time to heal from this kind of trauma, and the mind that often takes longer." He shifted his gaze back to Adam, his expression softening. "We have to be patient." The word patient seemed to echo in the small room, a foreign concept to both Newman men. While the quiet war of attrition continued at the hospital, a storm of a different kind was brewing within the sleek, modern confines of the Chancellor Winters conference room. The long, polished table reflected the tense faces of the executives gathered around it, a mosaic of ambition, anxiety, and simmering resentment. At the head, Billy Abbott was in his element, a whirlwind of manic energy, pacing as he laid out a bold, some would say reckless, new marketing campaign targeting a core demographic of Newman Enterprises. "They're vulnerable right now," he asserted, slapping a hand down on a stack of market analysis reports. With Adam out of the picture and Victor distracted, their public image is softer than it's been in years. "We strike now, we can carve out a 5-point market share before they even know what hit them." He looked around the room, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. Lily Winters, seated with the poise of the CEO she was, watched him with a growing sense of unease. She saw the familiar glint in his eye, the one that preceded his most self-destructive plunges. "Billy, we've discussed this," she said, her voice calm but firm, cutting through his fervor. "Aggression for aggression's sake is not our brand. Chancellor Winters is built on stability, on innovation, yes, but not on predatory tactics that could backfire spectacularly. She glanced at the others, sensing the divided loyalties in the room. We look like vultures circling a wounded animal. Billy stopped his pacing and leaned on the table, his gaze locking with hers. This isn't about looking like vultures, Lily. It's about survival. It's about seizing an opportunity. Or have you forgotten what it's like to be in a real fight with the Newmans? The challenge was deliberate. A low blow meant to remind her of their shared history, of the times they had to fight tooth and nail for every inch of ground against Victor's empire. The air crackled between them, a decades-long partnership straining under the weight of fundamentally different philosophies. Devin Winters, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally interjected. Lily has a point, Billy. There's a line, and this campaign, the way it's framed, crosses it. We can be competitive without being cruel. Billy scoffed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Cruel? This is business. Since when is winning cruel? The meeting devolved into a tense back and forth, a microcosm of the larger battle between the two corporate giants, and a stark illustration of the rift widening between the company's leadership. Billy's personal history with the Newmans, a tangled web of betrayal and rivalry, was fueling a dangerously single-minded focus, and Lily was left to wonder if the brother-in-law and business partner she trusted was on the verge of becoming a liability they could no longer afford. Across town, in the muted, tasteful opulence of the Abbott mansion, the atmosphere was no less charged, though the weapons were words and wounded glances rather than corporate strategy. Jack Abbott sat in his favorite armchair, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the fireplace as if the answers to his current predicament were hidden among the dancing flames. Those were arguments of the boardroom, of ego and strategy. This was about the soul. He saw the raw pain in Lily's eyes, a pain that was now inextricably linked to his own choices, and he understood that he had lost something far more valuable than a corporate title or a seat at the table. He had forfeited a piece of her trust that could never be fully reclaimed. The image of Lily and Holden together, an image that under any other circumstance would have been a neutral fact of life, was now forever tainted by his own actions. He was the ghost in that room, the unwelcome third party whose shadow had fallen across the marriage bed. He finally managed to look back at her, and the defiance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shame. He saw not just the anger of a business partner betrayed, but the deep personal hurt of a woman who had been pushed to the brink by someone she had once considered family, someone she had trusted, someone she had, in a different life, loved. The victory he had felt after his boardroom maneuver with Jill now tasted like ash in his mouth. It was a Pyrrhic victory of the most profound order. He had won a battle for control, but in doing so he had demonstrated a fundamental lack of character that had reverberated into the most private corners of another person's life. The silence stretched on, now thick and suffocating. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What was there to say? The 5 words echoed in the space between them, a verdict that required no judge or jury. Because of what you did. They were not just words, they were a life sentence of regret, and as he stood there, utterly defeated by the truth he could not escape, Kane knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he would carry the weight of this moment, and the intimate consequence of his actions, for the rest of his days. The night had fallen over Genoa City like a heavy velvet curtain, and the mansion felt emptier than ever, even with the faint hum of the chandelier overhead. Lily moved through the hallway quietly, her heart pounding in a rhythm she barely recognized. She wasn't supposed to be here, she knew that, but something in her mind kept drawing her toward Holden's study. She told herself it was just a moment, just a fleeting need to be understood, to feel something other than the weight of Kane's expectations pressing down on her. Every step closer to that closed door made her stomach twist with a combination of guilt and anticipation. When she finally stood in front of the mahogany door, her hand hesitated on the knob, trembling as if it carried the consequences of the world. Inside, Holden looked up from the papers he'd been pretending to review. The intensity in his eyes was always there, like a spark waiting for kindling, and tonight it was dangerous. He didn't ask why she was there. The question seemed unnecessary. Instead, he closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and let the silence hang heavy between them. Lily swallowed, her lips dry, and realized that the attraction she'd tried so hard to suppress all these months was finally too much to ignore. She told herself it wasn't about love, not really, but the ache inside her demanded to be recognized, even if only for a moment. "Lily." Holden's voice was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that made her shiver. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and felt the chill of the room mix with the warmth radiating from him. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, but his words weren't really a warning. They were an acknowledgement of the tension they'd both been dancing around. She didn't answer, because any words now would betray the storm of emotions she couldn't control. Instead, she moved closer, each step deliberate, each glance loaded with everything neither of them could say out loud. Time seemed to slow, the world outside the study fading into nothingness. Lily felt Holden's hand brush against hers in a fleeting, almost accidental touch, and it sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. She knew this was dangerous. She knew Kane would never forgive her. Yet at the same time, the longing, the desire to be seen for who she was underneath the carefully constructed life, made it impossible to step back. There was no turning around. Whatever happened next would be irreversible. A line crossed that could never be uncrossed, and Lily's heart raced with both fear and forbidden excitement. And then Kane's voice broke through the quiet like a knife. "Lily." It was the single word that shattered the fragile bubble around her, making her stomach drop. She hadn't expected him to be home this early, and now the consequences of her choices loomed larger than ever. Holden's hand went instinctively to her shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance, while she stepped back, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable in ways she hadn't prepared for. Kane's footsteps grew louder, deliberate, each one a drumbeat of impending doom. Lily's mind raced. She needed to say something, anything that would hold him at bay, that would somehow explain the chaos in her heart. But what could she possibly say that wouldn't betray everything? And then, without thinking, without any filter, the words tumbled from her lips, sharp and devastating. "I can't stop loving Holden." Kane froze, the world narrowing down to the sound of her voice, each word striking him with a force he hadn't thought possible. His hands clenched, jaw tightening, eyes glistening with the realization of what he had feared but refused to confront. Those 5 words, the ones that should have never been spoken, hung in the air like smoke from a fire he couldn't put out. Every plan, every vow, every moment he had believed in was now fractured. Kane's mind spun, and for the first time in years he felt powerless, watching the woman he loved drift emotionally into someone else's orbit, unable to do anything but watch. As night finally settled over Genoa City, it brought no clear answers, no neat resolutions. In the corporate towers, the battle lines were being redrawn, with Billy Abbott's ambition threatening to ignite a fire that could consume them all. In the quiet, elegant homes, families clung to fragile hopes, praying that love would be enough to bridge the chasms of pain and pride. And in a hospital room, a father and son remained locked in a silent struggle, their future as uncertain as the shifting shadows on the wall. The game was far from over. The pieces were merely being moved, the next play waiting for the dawn. The brisk chill of a Genoa City November morning settled over the Abbott estate as the new day began, and uncertainty buzzed through the air like static. Wednesday, November 19th, brought with it a shifting tide of secrets, confrontations, and unexpected emotional upheaval for several residents who still found themselves tangled in the fallout of recent decisions. For some, the day promised closure, while for others, it threatened to unravel everything they'd been fighting to protect. And as always in Genoa City, what began as a quiet morning would quickly spiral into an explosive series of revelations that no one could have predicted. Over at Chancellor Winters, Lily walked into her office carrying a stack of folders that had clearly been reviewed long into the night. She was exhausted but determined. Ever since her complicated encounter with Holden, she couldn't shake the disquieting sense that things were shifting too fast around her, much faster than she could control. She tried to focus on work, telling herself the company needed her full attention, but her mind kept drifting to Kane, to her children, to the delicate balance she'd been trying to maintain between moving forward and honoring her past. But those 5 words she spoke in the heat of clarity, words that had cut straight through her own emotional fog, still echoed in her thoughts, and she suspected they were echoing in Kane's as well. At the same moment across town, Kane stood outside society after a restless, sleepless night. He hadn't even bothered to shave. and the slight shadow on his jaw hinted at just how disoriented he felt after Lily's revelation. He had convinced himself that he still had a chance, that despite their complicated history, their bond was unbreakable. But now he wasn't so sure. Lily's declaration the night before had rocked him. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the conviction behind them. The way she had looked at him had made it painfully clear that she was no longer living in the past. While Kane had been holding on, Lily, it seemed, had chosen to step forward. Elsewhere in Genoa City, Devon placed his phone on the kitchen counter and sighed heavily. There were too many fires to put out at once, both professionally and personally. The company was under pressure. Jill was pushing for answers, and Abby kept checking in, sensing something was off. But Devon's biggest concern of the day was Lily. He knew his sister well enough to sense when she was struggling, and something about her tone the night before had unsettled him. She sounded torn, conflicted, not quite herself. And Devon, who had spent his entire life trying to be there for the people he loved, couldn't stand by and watch her slide into chaos again. He grabbed his coat, determined to confront her and get ahead of whatever storm she was walking into. Meanwhile, at Newman Enterprises, Victoria was already in her office, her arms crossed tightly as she stared out the window at the skyline. She had received yet another vague message from Claire late the night before, and the unsettling feeling of dread wouldn't release its grip. Claire had been dedicated, loyal, and eager to prove herself, but she had been acting secretive and distracted for days now. Victoria couldn't figure out whether Claire was protecting the family or hiding something from them. And given the Newman legacy of betrayal, manipulation, and buried truths, all possibilities were on the table. At Crimson Lights, Summer sipped her latte while pretending to review a menu she'd memorized years ago. Her thoughts were miles away, circling around Kyle. Their latest argument had left her feeling both angry and strangely hollow. As much as she tried to convince herself she was ready for independence, she couldn't deny that part of her still longed for the stability she once shared with him. But Kyle had been unpredictable lately, torn between loyalty to the Abbotts, his complicated feelings for Claire, and the guilt he carried from his own mistakes. Summer set her cup down and exhaled, wondering how things had spiraled so quickly into uncertainty. A few blocks away, Kyle himself paced the hallway outside the Abbott boardroom. Jack had scheduled an emergency meeting with Billy to discuss a troubling pattern of financial irregularities. Kyle wasn't sure what had triggered the chairman's alarm, but he suspected it had something to do with the tensions between Tucker, Audra, and the company's expanding tech division. Kyle wasn't directly involved, but anything that threatened Jabot demanded his attention. And if Claire was involved somehow in whatever was unraveling, he needed answers. Answers she had been avoiding giving him. As the morning progressed, Lily sat at her desk flipping through spreadsheets, but the numbers blurred into meaningless shapes. When Devon knocked and walked in, she wasn't surprised. She braced herself, knowing her brother well enough to recognize the concerned look in his eyes. He didn't waste any time. He pulled up a chair, sat across from her, and asked what had happened last night. Lily tried to play it off, but Devon didn't let her. Slowly, carefully, she admitted everything. How Holden had made her feel alive again, how the moment had escalated, how emotions she thought were buried had resurfaced, and how confronting Kane afterward had forced her to be honest in a way she hadn't been in years. Devon listened quietly, absorbing every detail, then finally took her hand and told her that she deserved happiness, but she needed clarity more than anything. Lily nodded, though clarity felt farther away than ever. At Society, Kane finally stepped inside and ordered a coffee he barely touched. He replayed his conversation with Lily over and over again, searching for the moment where he might have changed the outcome. But no matter how many permutations he imagined, it always ended the same way. Lily choosing to move forward, and Kane realizing he had no right to ask her to go backward. He considered calling her, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he sat in silence, wondering how he was supposed to rebuild a future that no longer included the one person he had always believed would eventually return to him. Across town, tension was building at the Newman Media offices as Audra and Tucker descended into yet another heated argument. Tucker's obsession with taking down the Abbotts had reached a fever pitch, and Audra was beginning to worry he had crossed into recklessness. She reminded him that every move they made had consequences, and Kyle had been sniffing around their deals, asking questions he shouldn't be asking. Tucker brushed it off, insisting he had everything under control. But Audra wasn't convinced. She had been burned by him before, and the glint in his eye was a warning sign she could no longer ignore. Back at Jabot, the emergency meeting took a sharp turn when Jack revealed what he had found.